typically think of reading as a passive process. We expect our brains to just absorb information and its significance without much conscious thought or decision making. And we do automatically form connections and interpretations as we take in a text. But approaching the act of reading with some intentionality can help us track these natural connections and deepen our engagement even further. Close reading is the process of bringing direct and sustained attention to a work and its specific elements. This can aid in the development of insights and analyses and help us formulate ideas for responding in writing. While pretty much anything from a novel to a painting to a scene from a movie can be read closely, today we're going to practice the process with a short Emily Dickinson poem. I wanted to use this poem for a few different reasons. First of all, it's just one of my favorite poems of all time. I just find it so full of meaning and also weirdly relevant to our current moment in time. Also, poetry is rich with details to analyze and can provide us with a framework for close reading texts of any genre. Although it won't be necessary to unpack every single sentence in every single text with this much depth, the ability to break down, examine, and analyze language can apply to any genre, format, or context. Before actually diving into a text, it can be useful to do some pre-reading consideration of our own purposes and intentions for the reading experience. Especially when you're reading something for the purposes of writing about it or responding to it later, it can be useful to jot down some keywords related to your topic or assignment, potential ideas you want to have in mind, central themes from other related texts, or even some guiding questions. As far as our purposes for this close reading go, I mostly want to see just how much we can extract from such a short poem. And I'm also curious about how something that was written in the 19th century might relate to our present-day circumstances. So I'll start by just jotting a quick note up top here about my intentions. It can also be really useful to read a text or a passage out loud. I find that reading out loud can be a great way to notice my own reactions to specific parts of a text, and it also really helps me retain and process the content that I'm taking in. So I'll start by reading the poem out, and then we can actually begin the close reading process. Here is poem 372 by Emily Dickinson. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious, like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet, mechanical, go round, a wooden way, of ground or air or aught. Regardless, grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead. Remembered if outlived. As freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Now that we've heard the poem and seen it on the page, we've probably already started forming some observations. This is where annotation and marginalia come in. These terms are often used interchangeably with close reading and really just refer to the process of physically engaging with a text by making notes in the margins, highlighting, underlining, circling, or any other method of marking up a text. There are a lot of theories about how to best annotate, but I think what's most important is to come up with a system that works for you and allows you to bring awareness to your own thoughts, questions, and reactions to a text. A great place to start is with the broad, most immediately noticeable patterns. When marking these, it can be helpful to make a little key for yourself, especially if you want to use different color highlighters, for example, or if you have symbols in mind that you know you want to use for specific purposes. So I'm going to reserve my yellow highlighter color for literary devices and my red highlighter for rhymes, because as I did my initial reading, those are the things that immediately jumped out to me. So I remember there were some similes and metaphors, so I'll highlight these in yellow. There are also a few examples of synecdoche, which is a figure of speech that uses a part of something to refer to its whole. And these instances also make use of personification, or the application of human qualities to non-human entities. So I'll highlight those in yellow as well. Then I'm going to just go through and highlight the most obvious rhymes in red, which I can see form these couplets at the end of each stanza. Now I'm going to start considering the poem on a more micro level. I mainly want to focus on noting my own observations and my thoughts, feelings, and reactions in response to those observations. We're not looking for some objective or correct interpretation here. We're really more interested in becoming aware of the interpretations we naturally draw and understanding where they come from. Marking and unpacking the details we notice as we read will provide us with the foundation to draw grounded insights while remaining self-aware and self-reflective. It will also give us a visual depiction of our reading experiences to refer back to when preparing for discussion or written responses. Today, I'm going to complete this annotation on a note-taking app on my iPad for demonstration purposes, but my preferred method is really just a pen and paper. You can also copy and paste a text into Google Docs or Microsoft Word and annotate electronically, which can be especially helpful if you need to turn in an annotation for a class assignment. You can use the highlight and underline features, and you can also add comments in place of actual margin notes. Again, I'm partial to hard copy annotations because I like to use arrows and add in little drawings, but you should feel free to use the method that feels most natural to you. Some key things you might want to look for and note when annotating are interesting or ambiguous word choices, use of figurative language or other literary devices, details that seem connected to the author's main point, and any changes in the tone or language throughout a text. Really though, the main thing you should focus on is just keeping track of your own observations and drawing connections that will help you make sense of those observations. So as I actually dive into the lines themselves, I'm going to focus on just examining each detail I notice as I notice them. In this case, even the first few words after great pain give us a lot to unpack. Maybe it's because we're still all collectively in the middle of such a painful time period, but this word after really sticks out to me. Usually we see art and writing that's about experiencing pain in the moment, not so much its aftermath, so this is immediately intriguing. Then I also think about this next word, great, here, because it's not something we typically associate with suffering. Given the context, it would make sense to infer that Dickinson is using great in the way that it means large or powerful. But as a poet notorious for her wordplay, we also have to assume that she was conscious of the common use of the word to mean good or express some kind of positive reaction. I also want to circle formal here in the first line because I'm not quite sure what she means by a formal feeling, and I know I'll want to come back to that. In the second line, I immediately notice that nerves is capitalized, which kind of gets my eye wandering around the poem and noticing all of these other strange capitalizations. So I'm going to take a quick detour and underline all of these capitalizations that aren't at the start of a line. I'm not sure what to make of these observations yet, but I know that they're unusual and that in poetry, especially in Emily Dickinson's poetry, nothing is accidental. Now I'm curious about the word ceremonious in the second line, in part because it butts right up against formal from the first line, and these words definitely feel related to me. Ceremonies tend to be formal for starters and involve specific rituals. So I'm just going to again write down some of the words I associate with formal and ceremonious up here. This second line, the nerves sit ceremonious like tombs, includes our first simile, drawing a direct comparison between tombs and nerves by saying that the nerves sit ceremonious. This is also the first example of the synecdoche and personification we noted earlier, as the word nerves is being used to refer to the broader feeling self and said to sit as an actual person would. This is also our first strangely capitalized word, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit over here to the side. Nerves can suggest both literal physical nerves, which control our body's functions and sensory input, and the more metaphysical, emotional nerves, as in my nerves are shot. So, while nerves are typically thought of as active and directly connected to life and feeling, tombs are kind of the opposite, with such a direct connection to death. The word ceremonious, so close to tombs here, definitely makes me think of funerals as well. It seems like Dickinson is saying that a great pain can make nerves feel deadened and remain still, states of being that seem in direct opposition to their normal functions. This also helps me better understand the formal feeling from the first line. With the added context, maybe formal feeling can mean both serious or regimented feeling, like those associated with death and funerals, while also relating to the death of feeling, like we just read into the ceremonious tomb-like nerves. This idea is definitely also present in the next two lines, with our next example of synecdoche, where we have another disembodied body part personified and said to be functioning differently than normal. The heart in this case is described as stiff, which seems to directly contradict its normal job of beating and pumping blood, ultimately supplying our life force. So again, we have this implied allusion to death, or at least the absence of life and its typical functions. But the heart isn't just stiff, it's also asking questions. And these particular questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday or centuries before, convey a sense of disorientation. They're asking, in other words, did this actually happen to me? When did it even happen? Both identity and time, two constants we often take for granted, are suddenly destabilized. This, it seems, is an essential part of Dickinson's take on what happens after great pain. Moving on to the second stanza, we start off with yet another example of synecdoche, this time with feet standing in for the larger idea of the human body or the self. Three examples make a pattern, and again, this example of synecdoche seems to me to convey a sense of alienation or disconnectedness from the self. The disembodied feet are described as mechanical and said to go round a wooden way, relating back to the idea of bodily dysfunction and the stiffness of the previous stanza. These mechanical feet moving in a wooden way make me think of a cog in a machine or someone just going through the motions, as we so often do in the aftermath of something painful. As a poet and a student of poetry myself, I can't help but also think about the fact that in metered poetry, each rhythmic unit is referred to as a foot. While this poem doesn't have a standard meter throughout, this is pretty unusual for Dickinson, who typically used very specific rhythmic patterns and rhyme schemes. Again, this makes me think back to the meaning of the word formal in the first line. Could Dickinson also be referring to poetry here? As a poet herself, perhaps the aftermath of a great pain made her feel more inclined towards formal poetry, yet her metrical feet moved in wooden, mechanical ways. The disorientation we noticed with the questioning heart seems to come back in the next line, where we are spatially dislocated. The mechanical feet don't know where they are. Regardless, Dickinson tells us, a quartz contentment that is like a stone has grown. So let's dig in a little more to this last line of the stanza. Quartz is a crystalline mineral, but in this context, it's also a descriptor applied to the word contentment, which typically means a sense of satisfaction or a state of ease. So what do we make of this figurative language? What does it mean for contentment to be quartz and like a stone? Well, quartz and stone are both hard and strong, formed by the ravages of time. So too, Dickinson seems to be saying, is the strange detached contentment that comes after a period of such upheaval. Were the poem to end here, we'd be left with a pretty tidy progression from deadened nerves to quartz contentment. But we still have our final stanza, and to me, this is where the poem truly takes off. This, Dickinson writes, is the hour of lead, and there are a few different ways we can read this line. While hour clearly refers to a given period of time, given the quotes from the previous stanza, it's pretty natural to read the lead here as the noun referring to the dense and heavy element. However, again, Dickinson loved wordplay and dualities, so the verb form of the word, as in to lead toward something, is definitely present in here as well. Going back to lead the element, it's worth noting that this is the substance commonly and historically associated with pencils. And while I'm not sure if Dickinson wrote much with pencils herself, they did exist at the time she was writing. So with all of these connotations in mind, I wonder if Dickinson was saying that this time period, the one after great pain, is the time of heaviness, but also potentially the time of finding direction, or even of the impulse to write. Thinking back to the ceremonious nerves, the stiff heart, and the mechanical feet, we can see that there are many challenges that might impede this progress, yet its possibility is ever present. While the hour of lead could suggest a very hopeful reading, Dickinson immediately complicates this with only a single word. This time will be remembered, she tells us, but only if outlived. And this if is so important here. The possibility of progress we just noted is immediately met with the possibility of its opposite. Sure, we could outlive this heavy and painful time period, but we also might not. This connects back to the death and funeral imagery from the beginning of the poem, and also really conveys the gravity of what we're talking about here. Death, whether in the literal sense or a feeling and creation, is always impending in this poem, even as there is strength, growth, and inspiration to be gained from survival. Our final simile starts with freezing persons, and compares the way they recollect snow to the way someone might remember the aftermath of a great pain. Snow and the great pain are equated here, both functioning as the thing to survive and remember. Freezing persons and those remembering their hour of lead will both go through the same process of first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Chill here seems to refer both to a sensation of shock or fear, and of course a literal coldness. After this shock comes the stupor, a word we often apply to extremely inebriated people, as in a drunken stupor, because it conveys a lack of sensibility or awareness. This is something we see throughout the poem in Dickinson's focus on disorientation and alienation from the whole of the self. The poem ends with this final step of remembering, the letting go. It's not entirely clear here if Dickinson is saying that we are able to let go of our memories of this great pain, the potentially fatal numbness of its aftermath, or even of life and consciousness itself. But either way, we're not ending with a simple and tidy healing narrative. Nothing is simple and tidy in poetry, especially Emily Dickinson's poetry. And this close reading certainly demonstrates that. From here, I think it's important to zoom out a little bit and ask ourselves about the big picture. With all of this still fresh in my mind, I'm going to take a moment to write down some of my central takeaways. In this case, I want to just write down my overarching interpretations, or what I think the poem is ultimately communicating. And I think what Dickinson is really saying here is that in the aftermath of great pain or serious trauma, we can feel numbed, disoriented, and disconnected from ourselves. This is both a death of feeling and creation, as well as a feeling that is like, or at least related to, a death for Dickinson. Despite the very real possibility that we may not outlive our hour of lead, if and only if we do, can we perhaps be strengthened, able to remember and let go. To think back to our question of how this poem connects to today, I know I personally can relate to the idea that self-alienation and numbness follow a period of intense pain. I've definitely felt a sense of unreality, dysfunction, and numbness in these strange months following the onset of the pandemic and the summer's upheaval. Despite the fact that this poem was written literally centuries before today, these ideas feel strikingly current, and I find myself strangely comforted by the thought that some aspects of the human experience transcend time and history. What do you think? Can you relate to Dickinson's take on what happens after great pain? Before we end today, let's recap some of the techniques we've used in today's video. The first thing we did was some pre-reading consideration of our own purposes and intentions. Then we read the poem aloud. Then we actually engaged with the process of annotation and marginalia, with the focus on noticing what we observed in each line. Finally, we wrote down our broad takeaways with the reading still fresh in our minds. When applying these techniques to longer works, consider close reading specific sections instead of the entire text. And don't feel discouraged if this process isn't immediately natural to you, or if your initial close readings don't look as in-depth as what I've done here today. This video is simply to show you my process and give you an idea of what you can do, not set an expectation of how your close readings should go. The strategies we've talked about today are just some of the techniques you can use, so feel free to pick and choose or try something else altogether. As always in this class, reading and writing experiences are opportunities to strengthen our critical thinking abilities, but also to turn that analysis back on ourselves and the world around us. If you end your close reading with a feeling of realization, recognition, or even some unanswered questions, you can consider it a resounding success.